The honourable member from Spadina, Fort York.
Mr. Speaker, on November 6th, I had asked the government if it would take any action to address hatred targeting Jewish communities by pro-Hamas terror rallies across Canada. There were rallies in Toronto where genocidal slogans called for violent acts against innocent people. And at a solidarity rally at Queen's Park, where I proudly stood with Toronto's Iranian and Jewish communities, a Jewish woman was later assaulted for the simple act of holding a poster of a hostage. And actually, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take the opportunity to recognize that person, Olga, who I've since gotten to know. And I want to thank Olga for her advocacy and countless others calling for the immediate and unconditional release of the 136 hostages still being held by Hamas. Hamas and the militants holding the hostages should release them so that a path to peace, a just and durable peace in the Middle East, can be possible. Now, Mr. Speaker, I had asked the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada why he was being so silent on the grotesque and illegal displays of anti-Semitism, hatred, and public incitement. Because honestly, Mr. Speaker, I just couldn't understand why he was turning a blind eye to these rallies in Toronto, in the city where he's also an MP, that were clearly supportive of Hamas, a listed terrorist organization. So I reminded the minister that Canadians believe in the rule of law, not mob rule. And I asked him if he was engaging his provincial and territorial counterparts to ensure that Canada's hate propaganda laws were being enforced. In response, the Minister of Public Safety indicated the government was far from being silent. He claimed that he condemned all incitements to violence and all expressions of hate, and that allegedly the government is there for all communities. The key word in the minister's response, Mr. Speaker, was all. And sure, other than Hamas and other terrorists, who wouldn't be against all hate and stand for all communities? Except, since October 7th, all communities are not being targeted. It's one particular community that's being disproportionately targeted, and that is the Jewish community in Toronto and across Canada. Protesters only seem to care about intimidating innocent Canadians who are Jewish. It's Jewish-owned businesses in Toronto and in my riding being vandalized. It's Jewish schools receiving bomb threats, and it's even a Jewish-owned deli that was firebombed in Toronto. So this evening, I want to focus on a specific, tangible action that the government can take, but thus far has not. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask if the government will follow in the leadership of two democracies, Austria and Germany, two nations that know all too well the levels that hatred and anti-Semitism can lead to. Both states have banned the use of the protest slogan, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." Mr. Speaker, freedom of expression does not mean someone has the right to call for genocide, and the Austrian and German governments are painfully aware of the true meaning of the slogan in Hamas terms. It calls for the elimination of the State of Israel. Just yesterday, a motion was filed in the Dutch Parliament to do what the Austrians and Germans have done. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask if the government will take this tangible action to actually fight hate in Canada against an identifiable group and a minority, the Jewish community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General of Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Everyone in this country has the right to live their life free from fear of attack or abuse because of who they are as an individual. Mr. Speaker, hatred that targets people based on race, faith, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, disability, or any other personal characteristic is counter to Canadian values. Everyone in Canada deserves a safe space to be themselves and to thrive. Unfortunately, hate, intolerance, and racism, and particularly anti-Semitism, exist in many ugly and dangerous forms throughout Canadian society and the world. Our government is taking action to combat this issue. For example, in the fall, the Minister of Public Safety announced enhancement to the Security Infrastructure Program, which will help all communities which are understandably concerned for their safety to better prepare for and discourage any potential acts of violence. The Minister announced an additional $5 million for this program in light of the rising hate we are seeing in this country. I think this is an important investment. I can give you a personal example, Mr. Speaker. The Justice Minister and myself attended the Bosnian Islamic Center in my own riding to discuss some of the funding they received through this program for security purposes. I also want to mention the upcoming online safety legislation from the Minister of Justice. Hate exists in many forms, including online, and we want to combat hate in all its forms. I'm looking forward to this legislation being tabled, Mr. Speaker. I have no doubt that in many of the Jewish community, for many in the Jewish community, recent events have undermined your faith in what Canada stands for. I want to assure you that I and the Minister of Justice and our government stand firmly opposed to anti-Semitism and hate in all its forms and will continue to work to combat it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Spadina, Fort York.
Mr. Speaker, the slogan that I've referenced, its use at Canadian pro-Hamas terror rallies sends a message of intolerance and hatred towards an identifiable group of Canadians, a minority, the Jewish community. Is our government and the hate propaganda enforcement system that oblivious to the obvious? Mr. Speaker, I can't emphasize enough that delaying a rapid and direct response to hate propaganda and racism is a matter that Canadians are very concerned about. The federal government can't ignore or sidestep its responsibilities to upholding Canada's hate laws. There are provisions and the working to eradicate anti-Semitism here in Canada. As is the case of justice, delaying a response to racism and hate denies the removal of this scourge. Anti-Semitism must be met directly and by the full extent of Canadian law. That takes action, not more platitudes, Mr. Speaker. So I'll ask again, will the government take direct action to address this recurring hate?
The honourable member from Etobicoke Lakeshore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The answer is yes. As I noted, our government has made several investments to address hate crime in Canada. The $5 million expansion of the SIP program, which I mentioned, includes programs in my riding and in other ridings across the country. Our government has acknowledged the realities of racism and prejudice in the country, something not all parties are prepared to do. We are committed to build a safer, stronger, and more inclusive and just future for all by fighting hate and discrimination. And Mr. Speaker, I will conclude by saying they are not just words, there are actions being taken and further action will continue to be taken, and we stand by this commitment, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.